Welcome to Thursday Live, and it is the very first Thursday Live of August, and I am so happy for each and every one of you who've decided to connect through this midweek time together, and I've been watching you all connect with one another on the chats and the various platforms, and it's funny because so many of your names I know, and just fond memories. John Parker's on here. Hey, John, I just want to say hello. John used to be on my team years ago and a big part of Northridge for so many years. It's so much fun to have memories associated with so many of you. And I just want to say hi, whether I've ever met you or not, whether this is your first time to Thursday Live or not, whether you've been a part of the Northridge family forever, or you're not a part of the Northridge family. Thursday Live is just a time to break away for a few minutes midweek when all the gravity's on us and all the things and challenges that we face are ever present, and to just forget about them for a couple of seconds and to focus on something encouraging. In fact, this last weekend at Northridge Church, we had one of our favorite guest teaching pastors, Tim Elmore, and he did a talk on fountains and drains. And basically the idea was, in fact, if you saw it, hey, make sure you tell me what you thought of it. But I just thought it was such a great reminder. We're either fountains flowing out and adding to people's lives beauty and encouragement and all of that, or we're drains, we're draining them. And Thursday Live, it just reminded me of what I want Thursday Live to be. I want this to be a fountain experience in your life. And so I hope it is. And so hey to each and every one of you here, and thanks for those of you who are facilitating these chats. And good night. I even see my son, Blake Powell, on here. Hey, Blake, it's good to see you on here. And so with that, just jump right in. Let's have our breakaway moment, and then we can get on with our evenings. And again, I just want to thank you so much for making this an important part of your week. And if this is your first Thursday Live, I hope it will become an important part of your week. And for all of us who engage this way, won't you please, subscribe to this and like it and invite other people to it? We want to make sure we're expanding. We want to be more like a Bellagio fountain than a water fountain. And so the only way to do that is for us to be encouraged by it and to share it. Recently, I was really, really impacted by a quote out of The Utmost for His Highest by Oswald Chambers, which many of you know, and I've said it 1,000 times, I've been going through. This is the quote, and I just really, really want to paraphrase it for you. I've added a couple of words, but this is the thrust of the quote. When we genuinely understand and believe what God is after, we will not get mean and cynical. Let me say it again. And I think I added the word believe and a couple other things, but when we genuinely understand and believe what God is after, what God is up to, what God is really doing in the world that we're experiencing in our lives, we will not get mean and we will not get cynical. I mean, that's a huge quote. And let me tell you a couple of reasons it impacted me. One of the first reasons it impacted me is when I read those two words, mean and cynical, I just felt like it was such an apt description of the world that we live in these days. I mean, we live in a mean and cynical world. We just do. I really don't have to prove it to you. Most of you are probably nodding your heads, but get on social media for a couple of seconds and just remember, I'm telling you to get on social media as an experiment to prove that the world's mean and cynical. I'm not encouraging you to get on social media if you're finding yourself living in despair and grief and, dark clouds are all over your heads these days, because it'll take you further down. Talk about a drain, right? To experience mean and cynical. And so social media shows it to be true. News. I'm finding myself watching less and less news. In fact, I try and just read a news feed that has a great diversity of news and just a limited amount of time. I don't do it throughout the day. I don't have my phone beeping every time something's happening in the world. I just don't need it. But even in news feeds that are just the word written, the mean and cynical can be easily seen. In fact, all you have to do is watch how people interpret the news, and they can be mean and cynical, whatever their spectrum of belief is. And you can do the same thing in your personal reactions. I find you don't have to go far in personal reactions to find mean and cynical things. Even if you agree with the people, they're being mean and cynical. And it's just not great. And so it impacted me when he says, when we genuinely understand and believe what God is after, we will not get mean and cynical. In other words, if the world could genuinely understand what God's up to, what God's after, what God's ultimately doing, what his ultimate vision and direction for the story is, and if we would just trust him in that, really believe him in it, we wouldn't be mean and cynical. It would change the world. It would go from darkness to light. And that's what Jesus said. When you really understand what God's up to, when you really believe, when you really know him, you'll be the light of the world. You'll no longer be contributing to the darkness. And let me tell you now the sad side of this. It's easy for me to talk about how it's apt for the world. It's an apt description for what the world's like, and all those bad people on social media and all of that. But let me just tell you that I find that it's often an apt description for me. I mean, I too can become mean and cynical. Now, the truth is, because of my position as a pastor, because of, the long story I have of being a Jesus follower, I've learned to not be really public with my mean and cynical. It's not like I'm going to do this on the platform at Northridge Church. It's not like I'm going to do this here on Thursday Live. It's not like I'm going to go on social media and my Twitter account or my Instagram account or my Facebook is going to become filled with all kinds of mean junk and cynical junk. But I know who I am on the inside, and those who are closest to me can see the more jaded natures, and even when my intensity turns from a positive intensity to a meanness, and it can happen so quickly, it can be an apt description of me, mean and cynical. And it's amazing how I can go from 0 to 100 in this so quickly. And I'll just give you examples. It happens in ministry. It's happened in ministry ever since I've been in ministry. This is where I can tell some stories, I guess. But the very first church I pastored, I had been an assistant pastor for a while in Rhode Island, and it was a privilege to be there. But when I left there, I became a senior pastor for the very first time in a little teeny church, not that far, really, from where Northridge is today. A little teeny church called Andersonville Community Church. And it was a really, really, really small church of 18 when I went. It did get up to, close to 100 within the 6-month period that I was there. But I'm just going to tell you, as optimistic as I was by nature, as passionate as I was to be telling the story of Jesus, as grateful as I was to be having the privilege to be called pastor. In fact, kind of an aside that's not so much of an aside, this little church had a sign outside it. It was it truly was like this white, typical country church looking place. And it had a sign out front. And when I became their pastor, they had written on there, Pastor Brad Powell, or Brad Powell Pastor. And I remember going out quite often and looking at that going, I can't believe that I get to be the pastor of a church. I mean, it was such a positive, exciting, affirming experience for me. But boy, did that change quickly. Because it was filled. There was a reason this church was only 18 when I went. It was a mean and hostile community. No one wanted to go there. They talked about the love of Jesus. They hadn't experienced it in a long time from my experience. It was awful. And Roxanne and I showed up and we started doing ministry in new ways, and new people started coming in. It was just a beautiful thing. And the original community hated all these new people coming in and messing up their church and changing their church. And this young new pastor didn't know what he was doing. We've never done it that way here before. And they just started getting more and more and more angry. And it started getting more and more and more obvious. It went from covert to overt. And just long story short, and if you've known me a long time, you've heard some of these stories, but they started doing these secret meetings with the people who were members of the church, the 18 and the people who hadn't come forever, to vote me out. And I remember having an elders meeting one time, and they said, we've decided that all you can do is speak. You can have no more influence and all this. And it was awful. And the hostility and the meanness, and they were taking it out on Roxanne. And so I just, I prayed a lot about it, got a lot of counsel, didn't believe I was called there for a long-term ministry, so I wasn't going to blow the place up, and I just resigned. This will give you a sense of these people. I resigned. There were people crying that had just recently come to faith. We had just baptized 18 people. There were new families in this place. And one of the elders got up and prayed to end the service and thanked God for answering their prayers. That afternoon, can you believe that's gross? That afternoon, I got a letter from a couple that said, we'll give you $3,000 personally if you'll stay and be the pastor. We've been looking for a church for a long time, and we want you to be our pastor. And of course, I couldn't do that. And then one of those elders came over to our house and had the gall to say, we'd be glad to help you move out of our parsonage. And just want you to know, you're one of the best speakers I've ever heard, but you're one of the worst pastors. And I have to tell you, man, I got from 0 to 100, mean and cynical real quick. I threw up my hands and said, I don't need this. It was in those moments I wanted to quit the ministry. It was easy. And I was in those moments failing to understand and believe in what God was after, what God was up to. I forgot. I was looking at these people, not at God, not what God was up to, but what these people were like, and it just peeved me. Same thing happened, in the early days of Northridge. I'll never forget. My dad got all the tapes. Back then they were tapes. It wasn't online. There was no online. But the church sent him all the tapes of my messages. And I'll never forget getting a call from my dad. And he was saying, son, I'm really concerned for you. And I said, what? And he goes, I just listened to your last talk. Called them sermons back then. And I'm going to tell you, I don't know what it was, but it was the angriest messages I've ever heard you preach. Why were you so angry, and why were you taking it out on the people? And what he didn't know is that just before I got up to speak, someone literally grabbed me by the tie and, called me a bad name and said, we know what you're doing. And I just went after it. And then in that moment, I had to go up and speak. And I became mean and cynical in my sermon. It defined me, because in that moment, I wasn't understanding what God was up to. I wasn't believing and trusting in what God was up to. I was PO'd at what this person just did, and I was preaching that way. So it's not just an apt description. I understand how so many people, so many of us, are mean and cynical on social media. I understand how we get there. I too get there. But it's a clear indication that we're not understanding what God's up to. We're not focused on what God's up to. We're not trusting in what God's doing. We're getting messed up by people. And that's what Thursday Live's all about. We need to break away and refocus on what God's doing, on what God's up to, and fire up our faith and trust in Him again. Same thing happens in my personal life. And I have to tell you, there are times when I'm discouraged, or betrayal things are happening, or I'm being misinterpreted, judged, or, all kinds of things that can happen in life. In my personal life, I can become mean and cynical, and the people around me can get all the spillage of that. And my tendency when I'm being betrayed or hurt or disappointed or judged or misinterpreted or whatever, is to get mean, rather cold and heartless and detached and cynical, jaded, dark. I'm just curious, can you guys relate to this? I mean, I as I look over here, can you relate to this kind of experience? Can you detect the mean and cynical spirit in yourself at all these days? And that's something we have to be aware of. And thus, the power of that quote. And I love it that Darlene said yes. Robin Fry said yes. And, we can relate to it. And that's the power of that quote. When we genuinely understand and believe what God is after, we will not get mean and cynical. For me, it becomes a read on whether or not I'm really focused on what God's doing, whether I'm really understanding what God's up to and remembering, and whether I'm really trusting God, or whether I'm losing that in the whirlwinds of my life and the difficulties and the hurts and the pains, challenges, the dark aspects of my life. And you can do the same thing. If you're defined at all by meanness and being jaded and cynical, it's you. It reminds me that when I allow myself to become mean and cynical, it's because I have my eyes in the wrong place. And it can remind you of the same thing. So when I see myself going there, to this place where I'm just mean or cynical, I feel it boiling within. I have to recalibrate. I have to be wise enough to step back and remind myself what God is really after in my life, what God's up to, not what these people are doing. The truth is, I've been at Northridge now over 30 years, but it's the fourth church I've been the senior pastor of. And the same kinds of people are in every church. Their names are different, but they're there because the same kinds of people in every community and every family and every school and every business, they're there. The names are different, but it's the same thing. And I have to recalibrate by reminding myself what God is really after in my life, what God is up to, what God is using all these environmental poisons surrounding me to accomplish. And I have to once again seek to understand it and believe it. And so I just thought tonight, as we recalibrate, as we seek to remind ourselves to understand what God is up to and believe and trust in Him instead of, responding reactively to all this junk, I just give you some examples of how I recalibrate. Of course, I turn to His truth. I try to open the Bible and I try to remember what God's up to. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. Jeremiah 29, verse 11. Israel they were in need of recalibration. They were in a bad place. And God says, you guys are misinterpreting everything. He said, I know the plans I have for you, declared the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. That's what God's up to. He's trying to accomplish His plans in our life to give us a hope and a future. And sometimes it leads through valleys, and it always leads past people who are going to misunderstand life and reject God and misinterpret us and judge us and betray us. But for us to go anywhere, it has to get there. Joseph was a great example of that in the Bible. What's God up to? He's up to fulfilling His hopes for us, His plans for us, the future He has planned for us, to prosper us, not to harm us. What's God up to? Romans 8:28. And we know that in all things, at all times, in all seasons, whatever we're experiencing, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who've been called according to His purpose. It doesn't say all things are good. It never says all things are good. All things aren't good. Jesus getting nailed to the cross wasn't good. Jesus being betrayed wasn't good. Most things aren't good, quite frankly. That's why darkness is a metaphor of this world. But at all times, what is God up to? We know that in all things, at all times, what God is after is that he's working for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. That's what God's up to. Are we believing in that, or are we getting caught in the tsunami of the mean and cynical world we live in? And finally, James 1, verses 2 through 4, another little bit of trivia, and I might do this actually in a future Thursday Live, but the verses that I'm about to share with you, it formed the passage of the very first sermon talk I ever gave in a church. I was a young seminarian, and I was invited to speak at a church, and I had never spoken in a church ever before. I'm in seminary, and I'd never spoken to give a sermon, and they invited me to do it, and I chose James 1, 2 through 4. And so I know this passage. I understand this passage a bit, believe this passage in theory, but I don't always keep it in my understanding. I don't always remind myself that I'm not always believing in the meaning of this. Here's what it says, James 1, 2 through 4. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds. Did you hear that verse? Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds. It doesn't say you have a right to get mean and cynical when you're going through all the trials and diverse challenges and difficulties and troubles that you're going through. It's not what it says. It says when you understand what God's up to and you believe and trust in him, you can consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, even when you face the worst moments of life, because you know that the testing of your faith is being used by God to produce perseverance, character. And let perseverance finish its work so that you may become mature and complete, not lacking anything. What's God up to? He's up to building us up, not tearing us down. He's up to good. He's up to fulfilling his plans, which are to give us a hope and a future. That's what he's always up to. But often we get mean and cynical because we're seeing what we see instead of focusing on him and trusting in him. I want you to remember it's not enough to know the truth about God. We have to genuinely understand and believe it. And when we do, we will not get mean and cynical. Not on social media, not in our personal lives, not in the way we lead at work or the way we work at work, not in the way we do family or life. On the contrary, we'll be more like Jesus. Light instead of darkness. Jesus looked at the people who would follow him. He says, you're going to be the light of the world. Why? Because we have the privilege of knowing and understanding what God's up to, always working good, always building us up to get us to his planned hope for our future. And when we believe it, we can live in constant sunshine no matter what storms are flooding our lives. And I have to remember that. And I want to encourage you to remember that. And this is why we do Thursday Live, to break away and have moments like this. All right. I talked a long time, and I hope it was encouraging and meaningful. But any rate, Brooke Boggs is on here, and she says, mean and cynical is not everyone's mode of operation in difficulty. And she says, confusion. And Brooke, I appreciate you connecting with Thursday Live, and you're absolutely right. I'm basically saying that mine is. I very often can get mean and cynical and jaded and filled with darkness when these things happen. And I look at social media and I see a lot of other people mean and cynical. But if that's not your mode of operation and you're never mean and you're never cynical, man, that's awesome. And I'd never accuse you of doing that. So I appreciate you engaging that way. Sam Becker said, would love to have you find the notes on that first talk and preach it to us again and let us know how it impacts your life now compared to the young Pastor Brad. I think that'd be great to hear. You know, that's a great idea. I might have to see if I can find those somewhere. The pages of those notes would be very, very yellow. It's so long ago, but that would be cool. Keith North said, amen. I have to remember that he's building my resilience, even though I may hate this moment right now. Dead on. That's right. And hey, I was just reminded about Lincoln Cam for all of you who are joining us and are Lincoln fans. And you might not see him, but he's right here. Can you see him right here? And let me see if I can get him backed up a little bit. Come here, buddy. Come here. Come here. There he is. There he is. Come here, buddy. Come here. There you go, buddy. Lay. There. Now people can see you. Good boy. There's Lincoln and our Lincoln Cam. All right. Alicia said, thank you for the good reminders. Thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Pastor. Just what I needed from Darlene. And Augusta Simmons said, thanks for sharing. I definitely can relate when times get tough. Brooke Boggs said, never say never. It's just not an MO for all. Absolutely, Brooke. I appreciate you engaging the conversation. If you go back and watch this again, I never said it's the MO for all. I just said it seems to be an apt description for our world. You can probably agree with that. And I said it was an apt description for me. And then I asked, can you relate? And it looks like you can't necessarily, but I think a lot of people can. And again, this is why I like it. Very often, some things I say can be misinterpreted. One of the things I like about this forum is that we can connect this way. And I always go back and read all your comments, and I really try and engage. But Beth Elizabeth said, your dog is so cute. You Go Girl said, Lincoln with a bunch of hearts, and need a hat for Lincoln with a cam in it. Thanks, Lenny. That's awesome. All right, everybody. I really do appreciate you being here with me on Thursday Live. I appreciate the conversation and the engagement, and I appreciate people helping me to clarify as well. And Brooke, that's exactly what Brooks just said. Thanks for the clarification. Absolutely. Thanks for being a part of this. You're a faithful part of Thursday Live, I know, and Northridge. All right, I want to pray for you all before we say goodbye, and then we'll go on with our evening. But though we're going to go on with our evening, I hope you'll let these breakaway moments break into your life and help you to maybe shine a little bit more brightly. I'm certainly going to try. Pray with me. Father, thank you for these moments in time. I thank you for every single person who engages Thursday Live. I pray for you to give them grace. I pray that this would be a fountain time and not a drain time. I really do pray, God, that we would, shine a little bit more brightly because we're recalibrating our focus on what you're up to and refiring our faith and trust in you. And I just pray, I know we're all facing different things. I just really pray and ask you to touch people's lives, encourage them, give them the grace that's sufficient. And I'll thank you for that. I pray that as we, turn off the iPads and the computers and YouTube and Facebook Live and go on with our life, that you'd help us shine a little bit more brightly like Jesus. Help us to be what you called us to be, the light of the world. And I'll thank you for it so much. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, I had another comment that said, sometimes mean and cynical comes from the fact that we want to change our circumstance, but God wants to change our character. And man, that's the truth. God's working. That's what I think James 1:2-4 is saying. God's trying to work on our character. And I don't like it when he's working on me inwardly at times. That's how I respond. And that's a great, great comment. Wayne Curtis, thanks, Pastor, and we love you. Love you back, Wayne. Thanks for being a part of this. I appreciate every single one of you. I hope you'll share this with a bunch of people. Get people to subscribe to our YouTube channel or follow our Facebook Live, and make sure you encourage people to be part of Thursday Live. If you're a part of Northridge, don't miss this weekend. Really excited. One of our campus pastors, Jeff Black, is going to be on the platform and giving a talk. He's the campus pastor for Northridge Brighton. And it's going to be a really, really great weekend. I got to watch the talk this afternoon, actually, and I really think it's going to be a positive experience for all of us. So I hope you come. But if you're not a part of Northridge, connect with a church. We all need to gather together and be fired up, because when we're with other believers who are shining as light, it makes us shine a little bit more brightly. Thanks again. Hope to see you next week for Thursday Live. But until then, have a great week from Lincoln and me. See you later.